Okay, well, glad you're here. Glad you made it safely, and we'll be praying for everybody's safe travel home. But until then, let's open up our Bibles to the book of First Peter, chapter number 1. First Peter, chapter number 1, page number 1067 in my Bible. Probably close to that in yours, something like that, right? All right, we're on verse number 20. First Peter, chapter number 1, verse 20. Before we do that, so you went home, anybody go home and was like, oh, I needed to ask that question. And you wrote it down, and you remembered to ask it tonight before we started. And you have that question ready right now. Anybody? Jeff, you got a question? No. All right. Okay. The he in verse 20 is, we need to make sure we understand that. That's Jesus. So you look at verse 19, we're redeemed with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Verse 20, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised him from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. Now, what Peter is doing, now we talked earlier in the chapter, let's say about verse 10, when he starts talking about the prophets, and then verse 12, the angels didn't really have a full understanding of what God was doing with mankind's salvation. That's an easy way to put it. And so Peter was really telling the church here how privileged of a people they were, because in their time, in their day, while they were living, that they could see with their own eyes, all of this came to fruition. So they were really blessed people, right? Remember talking about that? And so that, if you don't, that makes sense, right? Like Christ could have come at any time, but he came in their lifetime. It was all the plan of God. And so he's kind of saying this over again. He's doing this again. He's stressing how important these Christians are, how important, how blessed they are, how privileged they were, because you had these thousands and thousands of years of human history, and God chose to send Jesus Christ to the earth in their lifetime. So if we were to look back over the history that we know, let's say Bible history, then we could probably pinpoint some times where, man, we would have thought that would have been a really good time to send Christ. I was thinking during the time of all the bad kings that were going on in Israel and Judah, and what a perfect time to send Christ. I would think maybe. Like, all right, so here comes one, and now he's teaching all of this wonderful thing. He's gonna be better than any prophet that's ever come, right? So surely he would have turned the nation around, and then who knows what could have happened then. And then maybe we could think, well, maybe God could have sent Christ during the captivity, or he could have sent Christ at any of these other major time periods in the Bible history or secular history. But he didn't do that. He could have sent him instead of Moses. Why didn't he just send Christ then? But he didn't do it. So he sent Christ in the first century. And so the church, the early Christians who formed the church, were in these days pretty privileged people. Now, what is exactly verse 20? What does foreordained mean? Like, you tell me what that means. What does that mean? You read that and you said, yes, that's right. That makes sense, because you know that foreordained means what?
Before the beginning of time.
Okay, it has to do with the beginning of time. Like, have you ever foreordained something?
God planned it.
Huh?
I said God planned it.
Okay, he planned it, right? So, okay, he planned it from the beginning. Is that everybody's pretty much understanding of foreordained? It has the idea of to planning, and if he's planned it, that means he knew. So he knew. It's to know beforehand. To determine beforehand? Okay, so that means God always knew that he was going to send Jesus, and he always knew that he was going to send Jesus at this particular time, and he always knew that he was going to send Jesus at this particular time to do exactly what Jesus did. He always knew that, and nothing that man ever did, nothing Israel ever, nothing ever changed that. Go ahead.
My version is foreknown.
Foreknown, yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the idea of knowing, knowledge, determining, which you got to do that if you're going to plan something and plan it right, Yeah, that's the idea there. So in the first century, this was God's perfect timing. And you read Galatians 4 and verse 4, where he talks about the fullness of times, the fullness of time. Like everything had just stacked on each other and everything was happening just right, just at the right time, and boom, it was time. The cup had filled up, so to speak. The hourglass had run out, however you want to put it, and that was the time.
Would it be safe to say God doesn't have the time constraints we do? And it's one of the hardest things for me to wrap my head around, is how he knows things, but yet we have free will. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So even though it's foreordained, to me, it's like he saw the beginning and the end at the same time.
Yeah.
And he knew the perfect time.
Right.
I've always said I'm a bush person. I know my little bush and my little moss rock and my little forest, but I can't see all the trees.
Right. I got you. Yeah.
He's got all the forest.
He's got the whole forest. He knows everything.
I'm a little bush and
He knows that. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, God. I think there's a difference between God knowing, foreknowing what we're going to do, and then God. Obviously, God does not know that He's going to force us to do something, right? And I think that's where maybe some get mixed up in the idea. Well, He's all knowing and all powerful, and He's all sovereign, and or He's not all sovereign. Then He must have planned everything. He planned it, and including sin. And I've read y'all quotes before where smarter minds than me have wrote that God foreordained sin and everything that man has ever done. God planned it. God planned that. That's different. I don't think that's true. That's different than saying that God knew that we were going to sin. Doesn't mean He planned it or forced us to do it. Yeah. And that's important to make that distinction between God foreordaining something and then just not knowing what man's going to do with his own free will. Right? Now, I would imagine that this thought here, because these Christians were going through some troubling times, that this would have been comforting to them. Because what suffering does usually will cause people to think that that's a sign that God is not with them, that God's abandoned them, right? And I think we can see, maybe some of us have been there before, I don't know. Or maybe somebody who has been there where, because all of these things are happening, it causes to people, it causes them to question their faith, and they start questioning God, as if as it relates to them personally. So, you got people asking, well, okay, so why did God allow, if God is there and I'm His child or whatever, why did God allow this to happen to me? And is going through all this trouble, all this suffering, is it really worth it? Is it really worth hanging on to my faithfulness during all this, when I could probably do some things that would help me out, or I think would help me out a little bit if I just kind of compromise my faith a little bit, or I thought God would protect me. What am I praying for? That kind of thing. Can you see how people can go down that route pretty easily because of some suffering? Is God really there? And then you start questioning even God's existence. And so, because of the suffering that they were going through, and we're going to get more into their suffering. We haven't read the whole book, obviously, but we know from verse, let's say, 6 and 7, that they were going through something. And Peter was kind of suggesting that they were definitely going to be going through more of it. And so some of those questions that I was just saying that people wonder about, probably, I mean, do you think it could have been running through their minds as well? Some of them? Like, is this really worth it? Is this church thing? I mean, is this Christ? Is this Christianity worth it? Is it worth being called Christians? And of course, we're going to get into that in chapter 4. But so people who if any of us have ever, that thought has ever crossed our minds, I don't think it doesn't mean that you're evil, doesn't mean that you're weak. And I think it means that you're normal, maybe. I mean, I don't think. I think where we go wrong is top, maybe. Where we go wrong is dwelling on those things. So sometimes we have moments of doubt and things like that, and it goes through our heads. And what gets us down is when we let those things kind of fester, and we dwell on them. And we need a way to get out of that. We need a way to get those thoughts out. They're going to come in, and we deal with it. We're supposed to be preparing ourselves for sufferings and things like that. And then when these thoughts of doubt and wondering about God and all that, our relationship with Him, that we got to get a way to get those out of there, right? And so you're not bad. You're not an evil person if your mind drifts in that way. But I remember reading, it was either Howard or, you're not going to know these people, but Howard or Warden, who was talking about having anchor points in your life. And he's talking about Bible verse anchor points. And one of them would be Hebrews 13 and verse 5, which would say, where God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Do you understand what I'm saying? Have an anchor point. So if we put our anchor there on that rock, where God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And so, I picture, and so we're up, here's the anchor, and we're up here on the surface, and we're in our boat of life, and things get bad and everything. But as long as we're anchored to a verse like, and we don't ever forget it, that God says, I will never leave you nor forsake you, then we can always go back to that and be grounded, and we can get through whatever is going on up here at the surface. You know what I mean? As long as we're anchored to a verse like that. And it doesn't have to be Hebrews 13 verse 5, but surely that would help. Because if we're wondering, well, is God really there? Is God, has He forsaken me? And, Hebrews 13 verse 5, if you believe that, I think that's a good anchor point, right? You think? Okay. Yeah, and then you add Hebrews 13:6, which says that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? That kind of thing. And that would have been especially helpful to these Christians here. Peter was writing to, because we're saying that it seemed to be their suffering was from other people, from non-Christians who weren't really going along with the things that they were believing in the way they wanted to live in a Gentile world, in a pagan world, really what it is. And so Peter is reminding them, hey, you know what? We're actually a part of God's eternal plan to choose for Himself a very special people. And they were going to be known as Christians. And that's you. And really, that has the same significance to us as it did to them. Like, you were actually part of God's eternal plan from the beginning. I think that's an amazing thought. I kind of like that. And it's not a false, not meant to give us false comfort or false hope or anything like that. No, that's a real thing. That's pretty nice, if you ask me. Jesus, you see verse 20 says, He was manifest in these last times for you personally, for you. For me? Yeah, for you. And in verse 21, this who is the you? Verse 21 and following actually describes the you. All right. And so you who believe in through Christ, you believe in God. This is who benefits from God sending Christ, because not everybody benefits from God sending Jesus. Not everybody, the whole world's not going to be saved just because Christ was once here. The whole world's not going to be saved because God's grace is so amazing. Right? Or wrong? I mean, you gotta, if you want to benefit from the gift that was given to you, you gotta receive it, open it up, and, right? Megan got a longboard. She got a skateboard. So she's not going to benefit from it unless she gets on the thing and rides it, right? See, it's not going to do her any good. So you see the gift, you got to accept and receive the gift, right? That's grace. Yeah, it's appeared to all men. That's Titus 2 and verse 11. The grace that brings salvation has appeared to all men. Well, among the all men, there's got to be people who are willing to accept the grace. So this is who benefits from God sending Christ. They got to believe in God. The people who believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. You believe that God glorified Jesus, and I think that's certainly in his resurrection, but certainly I'd say more so in his ascension, because when Christ went up into heaven, that's when he was glorified. And because what happened in heaven, you remember we talked a little bit about it Sunday morning. He sat down on the right hand of God, and so he became king over his kingdom. And then if you have you see there in the verse 21, if you have your faith and hope are in God, then Christ's precious blood benefits you. So, you want to ask yourself, a person who's reading this, and you want to make sure you're right with God. You want to make sure you're a Christian. And if you were to die right now, you're going to heaven. You want to, okay, does this describe me? You believe in God. You believe that God raised him from the dead, and you believe that God glorified Christ, and are your faith and hope in God. And so far, if you want the benefits from Jesus Christ's sacrifice, then that's got to describe you. Right? So I would hope that everybody would say, well, yeah, that's me. So at least so far, that's me. But the description actually continues on in verse 22, so you don't want to stop there. I mean, you've gone through 21, you've gone through all that, and you're like, yep, that's me. That's pretty good. You're farther along than a lot of people, a growing number of people in the world. So 22, 23. Since you have since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit and sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. Having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible, through the word of God which lives and abides forever. So this is the second time that Peter has brought up this idea of being born again. Can you remember the first time he brought it up? What verse did he bring it up the first time? About being born again. The idea of being born again, not necessarily those words. Can you see it anywhere in the chapter? In the Bible that is open in your lap? Anyway?
He has begotten us again.
Okay, you go all the way back. You got to go all the way back to verse number 3. He has begotten us again. That's the idea of being born again, right? So the second time he's brought it up. And it's a reminder that Christians live a new life. And you obey the gospel, you say you become a Christian or whatever, and so that involves a new life. You don't just have this one great day or where you just really want to do the right thing and I don't know, whatever you would say your salvation is. And then, of course, you want to do it by the Bible, but I'm not getting there yet. But then you don't change your life. Like one day you just having this, oh man, I just really want to be a Christian and I really want to do what's right and I want my life to be better. And then the next day all that just goes out the window. Like you just kind of go back and you're hanging out with the same people. I was talking to someone today about, it matters who you hang out with. It matter who your friends are, matters who your inner circle is. Because, you know, if you weren't living right and you got an inner circle that's helping you not live right, then you got to change your inner circle. Like, I don't understand why that. I mean, that seems like a really hard concept for some people. I don't get it. And so you live a new life. Being born again is like it's a new life. It's not an old life. The old goes bye-bye, and the new should be there to stay. And it involves you thinking differently. And I'm not saying you got to shave your beard or whatever, or cut your hair off and wear new clothes or whatever, unless they're modest, of course. But then it's about thinking differently. It's about thinking differently and thinking better, thinking on better things, getting rid of sinful things, sinful thoughts, sinful influences, all that. And then you be stronger and you're more determined, and you say, you know what, I have a new example I'm going to live by, and I'm going to see how Jesus lived his life and how his life is described and the Christian life is described in the scriptures. So I want to know those a little bit better, and I'm going to be a better person. I'm going to live a new life. That's the idea. And belief and prayer, whatever, and baptism is not going to do you any good if you're not determined to live a new life. You wouldn't be born again if you don't. That makes sense, right?
Yes.
And do we stress that enough when we're talking to people about the gospel? I don't know. So obedience, if you haven't picked it up already, is a theme in chapter 1. Obedience in verse number 2, you see it, and obedience in verse number 14. And then I would say in verse 15 as well, being holy is in all your conduct is behavior. That's obedience. And then here in verse 22, they obeyed the truth. Sanctification, verse number 2, involves obedience. And then this purification involves obedience. Sanctification and purification, really, really close. They really, really mean almost the same thing, but not quite. It's one of those kind of things. Purification has a lot to do with being clean. And we know, and we're going to see that Peter says in chapter 3, where it's not about the filth of the flesh, not that kind of clean. It's this kind of clean up here. Morally pure and morally sound, morally clean. There's one guy, one name is Mounts. He defines the word as like reformation. Purification involves reform, which is the idea of a new life, right? The changing that's supposed to take place. And so Peter's saying, I'm reminding you of when you obeyed the gospel. I'm reminding you when you actually became Christians. And so once again, you see the scriptures putting responsibility on us. Responsibility is on me, and the responsibility is on you. Man has his part to play in his salvation. That's not blasphemous. Yes, it all wouldn't have ever happened if God had not done what he did and foreordained it, and he brought his plan to pass. But he's not going to force us like robots to let Christ into our lives. He's not going to do it. That's completely against the scriptures, and I know what my Calvinist friends would say to that. There's this absolutely hilarious meme. Sorry, you guys, I don't want to bring up, it's a meme. You gotta have to get on board with the meme thing. But there's a picture of someone saying, the biblical Jesus. You got the biblical Jesus and you got the Calvinist Jesus. And the biblical Jesus is knocking at the door, right? Revelation 3:20, I think it is. Knocking at the door. You let Jesus in. The Calvinist Jesus is like the SWAT guy with the big door thing. He's bringing him in the door. Because if you're elect, Jesus is coming into your heart whether you like it or not. That's the idea. Even Calvinists find that funny, but it's pretty funny. But that's the idea. And they would say, that's right. That's exactly right. That's how Jesus is going to barge into your heart, barge into your life, whether you like it or not, if you're saved, if you're elect. Well, that's really not biblical. Man has his part in salvation, just like he does in election. You see, we talked about that. We have our part in election, and God has his part. God's part in our salvation here is seen starting in verse 18, I guess, redeemed, and then 19, with the precious blood of Christ. That's God's part. He foreordained, that's God's part. Manifest in these last times, that's God's part. And then our part is believing in God, verse 21, believing that God raised him. And then verse 22, obeying the truth. Tell me how do you obey a truth? It says they obey the truth. Well, and so what I'm asking is, what truth? And the gospel truth. But what is it? What? I mean, wouldn't you think that part of the truth is what verse 21 describes? Like through Christ, you believe in God, and then you believe that God raised him from the dead, and that Christ ascended into heaven. Do you see what I'm asking? So that's the truth. You have to believe. That's the truth you have to believe. But what I'm asking is, how do you obey that same truth? How do you obey? And somebody else knows. How do you obey Jesus' resurrection?
Romans 6 through baptism.
Romans 6 through baptism. Y'all remember? I know you're not answering. You're just waiting for me to answer. But you understand what I'm asking, though, at least, right? Because don't you think it's a weird thing, though? A weird question. Obeying a truth. Like, what do you mean? Like, this microphone's black, and this microphone. The truth is, this microphone makes my sound go. My voice go out that way. Well, do I obey that? How do I obey that truth?
I remember that piece of paper you gave us, and it's a wonderful way to people who may know the Bible, but they've never thought about it in those ways.
Yeah.
Question them, because when you're trying to teach someone, unless they come to these conclusions themselves, you're really not getting anywhere. You're just spitting out information. They've got to come to realization themselves. And
Exactly.
Those are the kind of questions that you can be asking to people.
Yeah, it is. It's a great question to ask. How do you obey a truth? Because obviously we have to do it. So what in the world does that mean? Well, believe in Jesus. This is what most of the Christian base says you got to do, and that's it. Well, how in the world do you obey a belief? That's what I would want to ask, and I would want to know. And you can't. Sorry, Heidi. You're not going to be able to give an answer to that. Like, how do you answer that? You can't give an answer to that. And so, what does that mean about the idea that faith only saves? If I'm supposed to obey it, what in the world does that mean? Does that make a sense? But if it starts making a whole lot of sense, well, yeah, you have to believe in the death and the burial and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. That's the gospel. It's called the gospel, and where therein which you are saved. You obey the gospel, and you have to believe the gospel. Jesus died and buried, and he rose on the third day according to the scriptures. Well, and I've showed this already, and it's a good time to bring it up. There's a pattern there, right? There's a form there. There's a pattern: the death and the burial and the resurrection, right? And we are to the Roman Christians in Romans 6 and verse 17 said that they obeyed from their heart that form of doctrine to which they were delivered. Well, they were delivered the gospel, the great news that Jesus died, buried, and rose again. Well, how do you obey that? How do you obey the death, burial, and resurrection? I thought we were just supposed to believe in it. Well, we're being told here that we got to obey the truth. And if you just let the Bible do its thing, you can see in Romans 6, Megan pointed out already, and many of y'all were already thinking it, you just didn't say it, I know. Romans 6, 3 and 4 says that we're buried with him, baptism, and we're raised to walk up in newness of life. We die to our sins, and we're buried in water, and then we're raised up to walk in newness of life. That's how you obey the truth. And if you haven't done that, have you obeyed the truth? No, you haven't. And that means you haven't purified your souls, and so you're going to go to heaven with impurity. That doesn't sound right. So it's something you should, something we got to think about, something we got to tell people about, because we don't want to be Christians walking around like just believing the things that people were saying are just telling me because they get up here and they have a tie on or whatever and they sit behind a pulpit. And my grandma believed it, and, well, there's a lot of famous people, and they have a lot of followers on YouTube or whatever, and then this video got 4.1 million views. I mean, there's got to be something to it. I was just thinking the other day, like, well, that's the majority, and we have this problem with the majority thought, where it's like we have this thing in our head, like, well, if the majority of people are believing it, then like this has got to be true. But you don't raise your children that way. Remember the old, well, if all your friends are jumping off the bridge, you gonna do it too? And you expect the child to say, no, mom, no. Well, it's the majority, so if they're all doing it, just go ahead, honey. It's probably right. It's probably okay. No, you don't raise your children that way. But when it comes to even more, and that's important, but more important is going to heaven or hell, and you're cool with just going with the majority, just because of the majority, you're not willing to just at least give the scriptures that you're reading some critical thought, and maybe think in your head, you know what, maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe I need to change my mind about that, because you know what, I don't really want to lose my soul. So if I end up studying with you, that's what I'm going to be saying, by the way. So we can just cut to the chase when we actually sit down and we talk about this, and I'll just get to the chase, because you've already heard it. Bring it
What
up
other
again.
truths do you
What?
have to obey?
What other truth do you have to obey?
I mean, once you've obeyed in baptism, aren't there other truths that you would have to obey as well?
Oh, sure. I mean, I guess like commandments. Is that what you mean?
Well, let's just look at the next part of the verse. Twice, love of the brethren, love one another. Starting there.
Oh, yeah. So that would be one of the commandments that we're expected to obey, right? Yeah. So they're told to love one another. Brotherly love. So there's two different kinds of love there. You got the brotherly love, and that's a whole Greek word there. And then you got when he says to love one another. So love of the brethren, whole different word than love one another. So what's he saying there? Either through the Spirit and sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart. I think he's saying that since brotherly love is really a lot of what it's a big truth that the church is built upon. It really characterizes the whole of Christianity. And you go all the way back to Acts 2 and see what those new Christians were doing for one another and read what they were doing. Brotherly love, there's a lot in there. Like 40 and following, Acts 2. It's a lot of brotherly love as well. And so if brotherly love, Philadelphia, characterizes the whole of Christianity, then Christians, and it does, that means that Christians in the church should actually be loving one another. Like, we should actually be doing it. If we would call ourselves Christians and we say, well, I belong to the Church of the Bible, then you actually really need to be, exhibiting love. And that word is the agape love, which means, and I've heard 1,000 different ways to describe agape love, but I've always thought it's a love that wants the very best for another. I think that's what it is. Like, you want the very best for the person that you agape.
Unselfish love.
The unselfish, yes. I have a brotherly love for my two brothers in my family, and my sister as well. I guess we call it, say that as a brotherly love, because they're my brothers. But then there's a whole other way I could love them with agape love, where I really want the best for them, and I'm going to do whatever I can for them because I love them like that. I want the very best for them, and I'll do whatever it takes. It's like a sacrificial kind of love, which I would imagine that's the kind of love that God showed through Jesus on the cross. So yeah, and then back to Heidi's point, I think she was making that, like, are we really, like, are we obeying the truth? Are we continually obeying the truth? We might, it's not like you obey the truth to get in, and then you just kind of do whatever you want. No, when we can go 1,000 different scriptures, which tells us that, no, this is a lifelong thing. We continue to obey the truth. Well, what truth? As Christians, we can just start with loving one another. Well, want to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, certainly that would apply to your own brethren in Christ. And so if we're not doing that, then can't we really say we are continually obeying the truth? I would say no. Two characteristics of that love, real quick, is fervently, and pure. Tell me what fervent. Well, you would put another word in there, and that would be what? Instead of fervent, you would say, okay, earnestly. What does that mean? If you do something fervently. Okay, maybe deeply. You love them deeply. You love them intentionally. You love them without ceasing. Maybe that's the idea of fervently there. Well, it is actually. And then pure. Tell me what pure in this context. We could say clean, but tell me what is from a pure heart? Okay, genuine. What's that? Undefiled. Yeah, that'd be more on the clean side, right? Morally undefiled. Yeah. But genuine, pure, sincere, maybe. Somebody's gonna say something. Free from any kind of motives. I could show Jeff some love because I just want to get something out of him later, But that's not from a pure heart, you see. All right, we'll see. I brought my book because I didn't think I was gonna jibber jabber that much. I was gonna get into the questions. So there's no way that I'm gonna prevent us from getting into the questions next week. So you got one more week to get all the questions done, and there was a lot of questions I thought this time. Like, it took me forever. So thanks everybody. We'll pick up. We'll say a little more about 23, and then of course 24, 25, and then we'll get into our questions.